Gary Varvel had been working as a political cartoonist for over 25 years before he drew his most iconic piece of art. Varvel, who describes himself as a Christian, conservative, cartoonist, and speaker, in that order, spent the majority of his career drawing cartoons for the Indianapolis Star. He lampooned U.S. political figures, ideological positions, and cultural moments. He published books, won awards, made a lot of jokes about who we should or shouldn't bomb. But it was only after he retired from the paper and went independent that Varvel created what very well might be his legacy. Sitting at the kitchen table, a woman reads an alarming news story from her phone. A man standing in the foreground turns a calendar page with horror. It is not the month he expected to see. Instead, it is January 1984. This comic, by Gary Varvel, is one of the very few political cartoons to transcend into internet culture memedom. Perhaps it's the broad applicability of the comic that made it so appealing, with its nearly infinite potential to make different jokes in place of its original caption. Or perhaps its staying power is because of the thuddingly obvious original art, an on-the-nose invocation of George Orwell's 1949 book, 1984. Here's a question for you. Can you tell me what the original caption said? No, not the Cyberpunk variant, and not the broken calendars variant, and not the one where it's about truckers not being allowed to masturbate at the Salina 52 truck stop. What was the original text that this woman was saying? I'll tell you. In January 2021, Gary Varvel's original comic read, "Twitter banned Trump's account and Google suspended Parler. What's going on?" Since 2021 was roughly 30 years ago, I'll refresh your memory. During President Trump's first term, many high-profile social media platforms seemed to wrestle with the question of if they should ban him from posting. On one hand, he frequently posted extremely high visibility misinformation, racism, and thinly veiled incitements to violence. On the other hand, he was the President of the United States. The Parler referenced in the cartoon was one of a handful of right-wing alternative social medias that sprung up around this time, which promised to host conservatives without the perceived censorship running rampant on more mainstream platforms. Finally, the day came that most social medias and web hosts, including Google, decided to boot Trump and affiliates off the platform. This is what the cartoon is referencing. Here's an even more difficult question for you. What was Varvel's political cartoon immediately before this 1984 one? It was this: old George Washington on the dollar bill, crying, hand over face. Why might this be the comic? Oh, because this is his comic about January 6th. Indeed, just 3 days before Varvel declared that we were falling into an Orwellian dystopic state, thousands of supporters of the sitting president stormed the country's Capitol building in an attempt to overturn the results of a democratic election at the behest of said president. The failed coup was, in fact, largely planned on Parler. And then we entered 1984 because Trump got kicked off Twitter. I've been thinking about Varvel's comic a lot recently, and not just because I recently saw one that's about the announcement of the steam machine.
February 1804?
No, I think the cartoon is emblematic of the use of George Orwell's 1984 as a kind of legitimacy booster for whatever thing a person is arguing for. Orwell scholar John Rodden said the writer fills a hole for anyone who wants to establish any kind of intellectual pedigree. Other than the Bible, I struggle to think of a book that has been used as such an all-purpose cudgel for different ideologies, the ideologue always certain that whatever position they're up against is truly Orwellian. And this has been true for virtually the whole of the book's existence. As soon as it was published, nearly all sides of the political spectrum grabbed hold of 1984 in support of the thing they had already been saying. Why is this the case? Is it truly universally applicable? Is the book so vague in its positioning that it can apply to everyone? Or is its legacy one of consistent, aggressive misinterpretation? Is there a right way of reading 1984? "1984 was the ninth and final book published by George Orwell. 1984 tells the story of Winston Smith, a man living in Airstrip 1, formerly Great Britain, under a totalitarian government." And let's actually stop right there. I want you to do a little brainstorm and think to yourself, what are the things that come to mind when 1984 is evoked? What are its most indelible concepts? Because although the book is 300 some pages long, I think you can fit most of its popular conception into a few bullet points. Here's my list: Big Brother and the Thought Police, Newspeak, the Ministry of Truth, Doublethink, and 2 + 2 = 5. And to be honest, maintaining 4 bullet points of general awareness 77 years after publication is way better than most books could hope for. Giving 4 major bullet points is, in fact, better than I could do for most of the books I read in the past year. But these points, separated from their text, are easily molded into any political narrative or attack. When Varvel summons 1984 to decry the banning of the United States president from Twitter, he is positioning Twitter as some sort of thought police. When Elon Musk invokes Orwell, as he has done dozens of times, it is usually some reference to a Ministry of Truth-like obvious lie from the government. Musk has referenced and invented Orwell's law, or Orwell's rule, he isn't particularly consistent, that any government agency or legislation will most likely do the opposite of its name. Critics of Musk could then reference 1984 again, accusing him of doublethink, given that he believed any government institution would do the opposite of its name, while simultaneously running a government institution called the Department of Government Efficiency. 1984 sales spiked in the early Trump years as the populace was presented with terms like fake news and alternative facts. They also spiked years earlier when Americans learned of the true scale of NSA surveillance. Bernie Sanders called the government spying Orwellian.
That most Americans do not want to live in an Orwellian society where virtually everything that we do is recorded.
Years before that, as the US and Europe entered a manufactured war with Iraq, 1984 once again took the limelight. Michael Moore's 2004 documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11, ends not with a quote from the book that inspired its title, but instead a quote from 1984. On Radiohead's Hail to the Thief, released in 2003, Tom York howls that 2 + 2 always equals 5. And we could keep going back like this. 1984 was, of course, referenced ad nauseum during the Cold War. It was illegal to own in the Soviet bloc, but it circulated widely underground anyway. In 1983, neoconservative war hawk Norman Podhoretz argued that if Orwell saw the success of capitalism and the evils of pacifism, he would join the neocons in opposing nuclear disarmament and attacking the left. In 1950, only 1 year after 1984's release, the writer Mary McCarthy coined the term Orwellian while commenting on fashion magazines. As an instrument of mass snobbery, this remarkable magazine, dedicated simply to the personal cult of its editress, to the fetishism of the flower, outdistances all its competitors in the audacity of its conception. It is a leap into the Orwellian future, a magazine without contest or a point of view beyond its proclamation of itself. A 2023 study by Imogen Burkett found that virtually all parties in British Parliament referenced 1984 or referred to things as Orwellian. Labour the most, as they were the opposition party during the research's time frame, but also the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, SNP. This was in reference to technology and privacy, freedom of speech, propagandistic naming conventions, the actions of other government. Ben Bradshaw, Exeter's MP, said that not being able to store one's bike on a carriage with a bike compartment was, quote, Orwellian. The imagery of 1984, too, is spread so widely it's hard to even grasp its influence. There's the Ridley Scott-directed Apple ad for the Macintosh computer.
Secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts, one cause, death, but we provide them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Then there are the parodies of the already almost self-parodying ad.
You liked the ad, right? The commercial, 1984, you liked it.
We showed a lot of happy people drinking Pepsi. We didn't say the world was going to end if you bought a Dr. Pepper.
The Simpsons did it twice. Futurama, an unofficial ad for Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. Valve did it to announce that Half-Life 2 would be available on Mac. Fortnite did it to rally support in their lawsuit against, ironically, Apple. It's hard to remember, but at one time, the concept of capturing one's whole life on film was enough of a pitch to be an entire reality show. Big Brother debuted in 1999 in the Netherlands, 2000 in the US and UK, and the entire hook was built around the ability to surveil contestants for every waking and sleeping moment of their lives. In 2001, the show settled a copyright lawsuit with the Orwell estate. It is a strange feeling, then, in the wake of all its references, to return to the actual text of 1984, a book that does contain its most cited themes, but is so much greater than a bulleted list, so much more specific than its citations give it credit for. The first thing that happens in the book is Winston Smith, a middle-class man living under the regime of Big Brother, takes out a diary and begins to write. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films, one very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been a Jewess, sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head. The woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering him up as much as possible, as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them, terrific flash, and the boat went all to matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, right up into the air. This is how 1984 begins, with an extended, horrible description of the bombing of refugees being used as entertainment. I was surprised to find the description of how Big Brother fostered a particular hate and distrust of women within Winston. He disliked all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. There are the public executions and the endless wars, the abolition of thought and moralizing campaigns against sex, the false confessions from torture, and you see what I'm doing here, right? While rereading the book, I was shocked to find so many things that seemed to speak directly to me, to the things I care about. The book is relentless in its depiction of the crushing of human dignity, the annihilation of art, and the annihilation of hope, and I read it and I thought, good God, Orwell has been on my side all along. And then we're back to the title of this video. Why does everyone think 1984 agrees with them? In many ways, I do feel a kinship with Orwell, because I believe his politics could best be described as annoyed leftist. If you've heard any history of why Orwell wrote the books that he did, it probably goes like this. Inspired to fight fascism in 1936 Spain, George Orwell joined the POUM, or the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification. During his time in Spain, however, he witnessed the various anti-fascist factions fall into infighting as pro-Soviet communists accused him and his allies of being Trotskyists. Returning from the front lines, many of Orwell's battalion were arrested and some likely killed by Soviet agents. He eventually fled the country with a new distrust of communism and a skepticism towards state control, no matter how beneficially it was pitched. This truncated version of events in Orwell's life is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. A fascinating aspect of Orwell's experience in the Civil War is his general ideological naivete while entering the conflict. He did not join the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification out of any deep connection to their cause. He joined because his initial plans to join under the pro-Soviet British Communist Party had simply gone awry. His alignment with the POUM was one of chance and convenience. I point this out not to diminish Orwell's experience during the war, but to highlight a broader trend in his ideology, that his deeply held moral convictions felt strongly enough that he would volunteer for a civil war in another country, were often matched by a disinterest in the nitty-gritty politicking of individual parties. Another element, sometimes left out of the story, of Orwell's disillusioning experience in Spain was that he was shot in the neck by fascists. If you were looking for his major takeaway from the war, you could read his essay, Why I Write, in which he says, "Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936, the year he went to Spain, has been directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." Yes, Orwell was a socialist for basically all of his adult life, and you can see this in his writing. His decrying of income inequality, for instance. England is the most class-ridden country under the sun. It is a land of snobbery and privilege ruled largely by the old and silly. Or you could read his litany of charges against capitalism. Here's one of my favorites. Private capitalism, that is an economic system in which land, factories, mines, and transport are owned privately and operated solely for profit, does not work. It cannot deliver the goods. This fact had been known to millions of people for years past, but nothing ever came of it because there was no real urge from below to alter the system, and those at the top had trained themselves to be impenetrably stupid on just this point. And yet, it is because of his deeply held leftist beliefs that he felt so outraged over the betrayal by the Soviet communists he experienced in Spain. When he returned home, he was equally outraged that he was discouraged from writing about said betrayal by his theoretical political allies. His writing was, in large part, motivated by personal animus. Dorian Lynskey writes that Orwell, quote, didn't personally know any fascists, but he knew plenty of communists. He was still angered by their hypocrisy years later. These stories are undoubtedly fundamental in understanding Orwell's project in writing 1984. What I have found equally revealing, though, are the tales of his earlier life, of his disdain for, but simultaneous participation in, the British project of empire. Orwell was born in 1903 in the British Raj, the British occupation of India. His father, Richard Blair, sorry, this is confusing. Orwell's birth name was Eric Blair. Later in life, Orwell would adopt a son who was also named Richard Blair. Anyway, Orwell's father, Richard Blair, worked for the Opium Department of the Indian Civil Service, aka the part of the British Empire that regulated opium in India and sold it to China. His father was, in a sense, engaging in a form of government-led thought control. And Orwell, too, maintained the empire. In 1922, he joined the Indian Imperial Police in occupied Burma, where he enforced colonial rule over the local population. His experience in Burma was the source for his first novel, Burmese Days, as well as the deeply self-loathing essays, A Hanging and Shooting an Elephant. In these essays, he describes the kind of doublethink that would later define the regime of 1984. He says that he hated his job, that he was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British, and yet, at the same time, he describes the rage he felt against the colonized Burmese, the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. Feelings like these are the normal byproducts of imperialism. Ultimately, the stories seem to recognize that the only role of the Imperial is to enact violence. In A Hanging, he watches the execution of a puny, bound and helpless prisoner, the clumsiness of the act, and the immediate repression of the experience by all involved. In Shooting an Elephant, he begins the story with, "In Moulmein, in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people, the only time in my life that I have been important enough for this to happen to me." The title of this story is not, or at least not exclusively, metaphorical. He is called from his station as a policeman to put down a rogue elephant. He doesn't particularly want to. The elephant is simply eating in a nearby field. But the promise of imminent violence attracts a crowd, 2,000 onlookers, who expect one thing and one thing only from him, the delivery of death. Orwell writes that this is the hollowness of the white man's dominion. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. He does eventually kill the elephant. He pours round after round into it as it dies slowly and painfully. All this not because of the danger of the animal, but because of the fundamental insecurity of himself as a representation of the empire. To come all that way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing? No, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me. And my whole life, every white man's life in the East, was one long struggle not to be laughed at. Orwell had a knack for participating in the systems he would later incorporate into his view of totalitarianism. He returned to India, in a way, during the Second World War. In 1941, he began working for the BBC, supervising and creating radio programs broadcast specifically to Indian listeners. And although he would eventually claim that he never said anything on air he wouldn't have said as an individual, he was undeniably creating a form of propaganda, sending forth counter-programming to what India might have heard from the Axis. He viewed himself, maybe, as a lesser evil. Quote, "I have kept our propaganda slightly less disgusting than it might otherwise have been." But it's hard to imagine it didn't sting to be accused, as he was by George Woodcock, of returning to his old imperialist allegiances. Maybe it was this experience, as much as with the communists in Spain, that convinced Orwell that the truth could be endlessly manipulated by motivated propagandists, broadcasting an eminently malleable version of the truth over the airwaves. Lynskey even identifies a time that Orwell mused he could re-edit speeches by Winston Churchill, creating a false recording of the Prime Minister declaring peace instead of war. When I look at Orwell, his history, his path that brought him to writing 1984, I see his overwhelming fear that the world was becoming something. He writes of the contradictions between his experiences and the reported word. It often gives me the feeling that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. In the past, people deliberately lied, or they unconsciously colored what they wrote, or they struggled after the truth, well knowing that they must make many mistakes. But in each case, they believed that the facts existed and were more or less discoverable. And yet, his sense of what the world had been and what the world would become was locked, somewhat absurdly, to his own lifetime. Is it reasonable, in the world of his adulthood, to fear that the truth would be forever hidden behind ruling parties and propaganda? Of course. But is it reasonable to assume that the world he was born into, a world where his father sold opium for the empire, where the same empire gave him the power of life and death over an occupied population, was any better at identifying the objective facts of history? I think one of the irresistible things about dystopias, of which 1984 is one of the greatest, is the sense of seeing the road in our everyday that will eventually lead us into the nightmare. But our sense of what the everyday is, what constitutes normalcy, what form our pre-dystopic notions of the world, is unshakably relative. Whatever we were born into forms our picture of what the world should be like, ought to be like. Our perspective on the dissolution of truth, of honor, and fairness inevitably begins there. For Orwell to write that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world makes him feel, in 2026, like a time traveler. How could he so foresee what would befall us? But in fact, the lesson should be the opposite. His observations not prophetic, but reflective of a perpetual feeling. And this feeling of the world gradually falling farther and farther from what it should be is not exclusive to democratic socialists. It is a politically agnostic impulse, if not, I dare say, an outright conservative one. You don't have to look very far at all to recognize how much of the conservative appeal is built on the promise that the world can be put back like you remember it as a child, to return to a more simple, more agreeable era, free of any socio-political conflict more complex than when mom makes you go to bed. An era that, in reality, has never existed, except in the mind of an infant. In truth, there are two different ways the world can shift towards dystopia. One way is built on action, the consequences of leaders and legislation, and the harm done to populations of people. The other way is built on access to knowledge, exposure to the truth that leaders and legislation and populations of people have not been well for far longer than you've been able to grasp. The world shifts towards dystopia because you learn to recognize the dystopic conditions that have already existed all around you. These two shifts are happening simultaneously. Orwell lived through the First and Second World Wars, trench warfare, death camps, nuclear bombs. He was not wrong in identifying the dystopic themes of his lifetime, the ability of new technology to exert new forms of control over the populace. But was he, I wonder, able to reflect beyond the lens of his own experience, have the awareness to know that the first time he recognized politically motivated lies and propaganda in the reporting around him was not the first time it had happened? The irony and the danger of these two shifts towards dystopia is how easily one can be mistaken for the other, especially given the inevitable nostalgia for the simple world of a child. It might be easy to look at today's protests, for instance, and assume that activists' demands are exclusive to our newly dystopic world. If you are, for instance, Roger Severino, one of the architects of Project 2025 and a big fan of 1984, you might see these social movements as Orwellian. He's said that today's left is forcing people to repeat a lie with their own lips. But if you learn even a little history, today's activists are easily identifiable as a part of a historical continuum. Protests against forever wars, against racial supremacy, or for queer liberation are not sudden constructions of the 21st century. They exist at the long end of a historical timeline, and they have, for the entirety of that timeline, been protesting dystopic conditions, a failure of institutions to recognize people as people. Perhaps the book's perceived political universality is the ease at which its message can be reduced to "you're being lied to." The Ministry of Truth, doublethink, thought crime, 2 + 2 = 5, all on their basest level, are shaped around "they want to convince you the world is a way that it is not." When viewed this way, it's no wonder the novel could slide so easily into any number of ideologies. Crowd sizes, war justifications, paid protesters, COVID lab leaks, elders of Zion, anything and everything. The more strongly felt, the more the other side is trying to make you believe 2 + 2 = 5. But it's not just the idea that you're being lied to. When pundits and posters refer to something as Orwellian, they are quite often referring to a censorship of dissent, that there's only one thing you're allowed to believe, and any other opinion will be suppressed. This is maybe an even more powerful feeling than the sense that you're being lied to, that they are trying to stop you from telling others what you know. This is the thought process that can absolutely fracture one's reality. One person's correction becomes another person's thought police. Why are those doctors so insistent that vaccines work, huh? Is it because they're trying to keep us safe, or is it because they're trying to silence the truth? It's because vaccines work. And perhaps the paradox that most separates us from the time of 1984's writing is the number of places that someone can be silenced. In an environment when everyone has been given the ability to publish, to post, to create a soapbox upon which to declare their thoughts, our questions of free speech are more often specifically questions of amplification. Yes, technically you can say something, but where? And how loudly? In 1949, when 1984 was published, you could be turned down for a newspaper op-ed? Real censorship did exist, of course, and would accelerate in the years to come with McCarthyism, etc., but the vast majority of people, no matter their views, were simply not visible enough to meaningfully run up against institutions that shaped cultural narratives. Fast forward 70 years though, and any random grandma could have the Orwellian experience of being kicked out of a Facebook group for thought crime. Any teenage boy could be banned from a Discord server because Big Brother took an interest in the messages he was sending other users. This is what Varvel's original comic is about, remember? Twitter banned Trump's account and Google suspended Parler, a form of censorship that only exists in the modern era. The usual response to this is fairly straightforward. You can probably say it with me. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence. Freedom of speech does not, in fact, guarantee someone a platform. Being banned from Twitter is the action of a company, not the government. It would probably represent far more of an overreach for the government to define the content policies of a non-governmental business. But I actually think Orwell would agree with Varvel. In part, at least. Orwell was a free speech enthusiast, if not an absolutist. He said he was committed to hearing the unfashionable opinion that everyone shall have the right to say into print what he believes to be the truth, and yet he recognized there were limits. When one demands liberty of speech and of the press, one is not demanding absolute liberty. There always must be, or at any rate there always will be, some degree of censorship, so long as organized societies endure. The full quote about everyone having the right to say and to print whatever they believe to be the truth ends with, provided only that it does not harm the rest of the community in some quite unmistakable way. No, my hunch, and I have to emphasize this is a hunch, is that the man would be shaken by the unexamined elements of Varvel's cartoon. Not that Twitter and Google chose to throw specifically Donald Trump and Parler off their platforms, but that the modern realm of public discourse is monolithically shaped and defined by enormous billion-dollar technology companies, that the same industry responsible for the decimation of Orwell's beloved newspaper was now the only place to go for information, that the policies of these companies were now the de facto content guidelines for public discourse as determined by solely non-elected executives. But that said, even though I do think Orwell would find this aspect of society dystopian, it's still not what 1984 is about. If Varvel meant to do more with this cartoon than simply lampoon Twitter and Google for being woke, if he meant to draw attention to the outsized influence of tech companies on our public discourse, he may have chosen the single worst victim for that example. If anyone on Earth didn't need to rely on the communication channels afforded by social media, it was the sitting president of the United States. 1984 is a book about the state's totalitarian control of every aspect of society, from industry to press to entertainment. From this position, the ability of a non-governmental platform to stop hosting the president isn't an example of Orwellian thought control, it's actually the exact opposite, a demonstration, in a way, of freedom. A private company acting independently of and antagonistically towards the government, which is way more credit than Twitter actually deserves, but still. Upon 1984's original release, almost all sides of the political spectrum flocked to use its dystopian vision to bolster their own platform. The exception was the communists. Orwell was already known for Animal Farm and his generally anti-Soviet views. Stalin was, though not the only, the most apparent analog of Big Brother. Masses and Mainstream, a monthly Marxist magazine, alliteration, titled its review Maggot of the Month, and wrote that the book's popularity demonstrated a deep societal sickness. Pravda, the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, said that 1984 represented the gruesome prognostications of a whole army of venal writers on the orders and instigation of Wall Street. It is ironic, so many decades and so many waves of influence later, that most reviews treated the book as inextricably tied to the moment it was published. The communists could only see it as a condemnation of communism. American Republicans said it was obviously warning against the New Deal. Mark Schorer, writing a contemporaneous review for the New York Times, said that 1984's kineticism may mean that its greatness is only immediate, its power for us alone, now, in this generation, this decade, this year, that it is doomed to be the pawn of time. 77 years and tens of millions of sales later, it does make you wonder, what is it about 1984? If a book is written as a warning, if it literally picks a date in the future to set itself, and then that date comes and goes, why do we still cling to it so tightly? Well, because it is not, actually, a book of prophecy. It is not about the world we're headed into, it is about the one we've found ourselves in. Orwell wrote 1984 only after he started paying attention to how ideological narratives of war and culture were spun. Sure, he repeated that he didn't think the world he wrote about will arrive, only that it could occur. But the fears he articulated in 1984 were not ones yet to arrive. They were already there. The world as a stage where superpowers would trade war back and forth, history manipulated and wielded as a weapon, populations taught who to hate and who to worship. Perhaps, if he looked back on his life, he would recognize that the same forces shaped the world before him. Perhaps if we looked back on ours, we would recognize the same. In the terrifying ending of the novel, as Winston is held prisoner deep inside the Ministry of Love, his will is obliterated by Big Brother's torture. You must stop imagining that posterity will vindicate you, Winston, O'Brien, his torturer, says. Posterity will never hear of you. You will be lifted clean out from the stream of history. We shall turn you into gas and pour you into the stratosphere. You will be annihilated in the past as well as the future. You will have never existed. The only thing that is forever, O'Brien continues, is Big Brother. Not the stars in the sky, not the laws of physics, only the regime, only power. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face. Forever. And in a way, in one very specific way, O'Brien is right. Not that Big Brother itself would last forever. Regimes change, empires fall. Even the appendix at the end of the book is written in past tense, as if looking back on a previous era. But as each of us begins to perceive the world, to recognize the machines much bigger than ourselves, to ask fundamental questions of justice and injustice, we find the boot that is always there, perhaps worn by one foot or another, but always moving down, always seeking to stamp itself upon the face of humanity. In a foreword to 1984 written by Thomas Pynchon, he writes that one of Orwell's terrors was that he might one day lose his political anger and end up as one more apologist for things as they are. And more so, that his writing would eventually be claimed by those he opposed. The ability of the ruling element to co-opt dissent was ever present. No one thinks that they're the ones co-opting 1984. We all view ourselves as Winston Smiths, having finally ripped off his blindfold, unable to ignore the horrible elements of the world anymore. And I guess, if I could make one plea to the entire political spectrum reading 1984, it would be, look at your targets and ask yourself, is this where power is truly gathered? Or are you being misled by a Big Brother so vast you can't even recognize it? Big Brother is not just someone asking you to change your mind. Big Brother is the war profiteer, the imprisoner, the torturer, the reality definer. Gary Varvel, for as mediocre as I think his comic is, did look and identify some of the major powers in our current ecosystem. And he did it by himself and chose to make it into art with only the help of one of the most powerful books ever written. So I think I have to hand it to... Sorry, what's this? Okay, so this says... So immediately after President Donald Trump was suspended from Twitter, the day before Varvel's comic came out, the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., tweeted, "We are living in Orwell's 1984, free speech no longer exists in America." So Varvel is just parroting. He didn't even think of it himself. He just... Mother... You know, making these videos takes a long time. It takes a lot of research. And it is right now the most beautiful time of the year in North Carolina. It is the blooming springtime. And I've just been inside for the last month reading about George Orwell. So this month, for the Nebula exclusive companion video that I'm making, I think I'm just gonna do a picnic. I think I'm just gonna go on a picnic. In 1984, actually, Winston Smith, the only times that he gets to be like chill and normal is when he leaves the city and he goes to the countryside and he's having, you know, these kind of picnics and these hideaways with his beautiful girlfriend. And so I think I'm gonna have a picnic with my beautiful wife, and we're gonna make some very good sandwiches. We're gonna make some very good food. We'll go out. I'll probably talk more about 1984 and George Orwell, but in a much chiller, much more normal way. Nebula, if you're unaware, is this premium streaming service that is run by creators like me. It provides kind of a healthier home for this type of work, free of copyright restrictions, free of toxic algorithms. You know, I should have made, I'm making a Big Brother reference. That's what this is. YouTube algorithm, Big Brother. Nebula, not Big Brother. Chill, younger brother. And for me, it's a place where I can put work unlike the normal, very rigorous, very, scripted essays that I'm putting on YouTube. I can do cooking videos, I can do picnic videos, I can do interviews, I can, talk for 10 minutes about the graphics of Arkham Knight and have that just be the whole video with how cool the graphics of Arkham Knight are. I have dozens and dozens of exclusive videos on Nebula, and it's also just obscenely cheap in a way that still kind of doesn't make sense to me, because everything else is getting more and more expensive, and Nebula is still $250 a month, which is so cheap it almost boggles my mind. I've also really been enjoying on Nebula how much stuff is coming there early now, as well as the exclusives. Tom Scott videos are coming out early. Patrick Willems just put out maybe his best video a month early. Sarah Z videos early. Innuendo Studios has some of my favorite work on video game storytelling, and a video that I think is still exclusive to Nebula. Come to a picnic, come vicariously experience some really good sandwiches, and then stick around on Nebula, because there is a truly unbelievable amount of good stuff waiting there for you, and it is only $250 a month for all of it.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory reports. Unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.